But documentaries have really come into their own in the last, I don't know. For me, I've always loved docs.
Yeah.
Oh, this is the Film Thread podcast, by the way. And we should introduce Morgan Neville, the director of Won't You Be My Neighbor, and the producer, Nicholas Ma.
That's right.
I was told seconds before we started recording, Nicholas will be joining us. It's like, good, let's get a producer's perspective, because producers don't always get to have these kind of conversations.
I've been doing docs for 25 years, and when I started, there was nothing cool about documentaries.
Right, yeah.
But I loved it. But I feel like a lot's changed. Like, documentaries have gotten better and more adventurous, but also I just think the access to documentaries has changed. Because what I heard for years is, I love documentaries, I don't know where to find them. So now if you go on Netflix or go on iTunes or whatever, they're just as accessible as anything else. So given the choice, a lot of people realize documentaries are great movies. So really there's been this kind of golden era of documentary over the last, 5 to 10 years, where so much great stuff's being done that I'm inspired all the time. I'm always blown away by it. And, documentary, if you really want to get into it, is like a very broad brush to talk about a whole bunch of different kind of films. There are many, many genres. Somebody once broke it down into something like 35 subgenres of documentary. That
I would believe it.
And because you can do a Michael Moore type documentary, or you can do a verite documentary, or you could do a documentary like this, which is kind of what would you call it? Archival.
An archival think piece.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Anthony and I both saw the film at
Yes.
Sundance, which I believe may have been the first.
It was.
Yeah.
Public, and you guys got a standing ovation. I mean, it
Well
was
deserved.
Thanks.
Thank you.
incredible. It was emotional. I think Anthony cried. I may have also welled up. But I feel like for anyone that grew up with Mr. Rogers, seeing Won't You Be My Neighbor it's not a traditional documentary. It's emotional for everyone walking into the theater. And I do say this is a documentary you need to see in a theater with an audience.
I mean, I often feel that way about my films, but I don't think I really understood why until Sundance, because that first screening was the first time we'd seen it with any kind of a sizable audience. And there's something about the kind of communal experience that Fred was fostering, the emotional experience, that just gets elevated when you see it with other people. Like it kind of the movie has kind of taken on a life of its own, that certain times, certain things strike people in a way that just creates this profound emotional experience. And I feel like we can't even take the credit for it, because it was really about us trying to give Fred Rogers this platform. I mean, for us, he was a voice that we loved as a kid, but that when I rediscovered him as an adult, I just felt like it was missing in our culture. And not that I missed him in a nostalgic way, but I missed that kind of moral, grown-up, empathetic voice that was really trying to advocate for how we should be a better society and not play to our lesser angels. That was the thing that I was responding to.
You described the very opposite of Twitter, I think, at this point. It's
Yes.
I mean, it's weird, because really it does deal with like how there's a meanness that's prevailing in our culture now. We're so disconnected in the sense that there's so few things now that connect us all. And I think growing up with watching, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is something that connected people of a certain age.
Not just of a certain age. I mean, it was 1968 to 2003 that he was on the air. I think we often think that fans of Mr. Rogers look like who we are because we're fans of Mr. Rogers. And then you realize that Mr. Rogers spoke incredibly deeply to the faith community, to the LGBT community, to the African American community, to rural communities, to the disabled community. And there's this kind of awe that engenders in one when one realizes that this voice that felt so personal to me could feel personal to millions of other people too, and that message, which is so strong, could still be unifying in a moment where we feel so fractured. And I think that's what's been such a privilege in working about Fred.
There's just been this lingering, just kind of a dreadful feeling in the world lately, and your film was really a breath of fresh air. Just this really hopeful and very inspiring movie, and just it was hands down my favorite movie I saw at Sundance. Like, it's what the world needs, to be honest.
I mean, I think it started for me with feeling like this is what I need, and then it became this is what all of us needed. And the fact that is contagious, that translates, is fantastic. But I don't think we knew in the beginning that was it. I think it was just, God, this just feels so urgent right now. And spending basically from the election until Sundance of 18, that whole time living in the land of make-believe, making this film, was kind of the best place we could have possibly been. It was like this amazing bubble in a very troublesome time for us to kind of be able to reflect on. Yeah,
it was a refuge.
Positivity. And I think it translated into how we actually made the film. I feel like we all took on a little Mr. Rogers. We all were nicer to each other. And, forget that. But it really was like the medicine we needed at the time.
Well, it's interesting that I think one of the first episodes that aired of the show is about the king building a wall. I mean, the laughter in the crowd, over the irony of that is just, where did you see these little finds of, oh my, and because there were so many connections to things that we deal with today with regard to gun violence, with building barriers and walls between peoples. A lot of that must have stood out to you. So tell me about those finds.
Well, I think it's interesting you bring up that first week on the program because, we actually screened the film twice that first day, right? Once in Park City and once in Salt Lake City, and for two very different communities of people, right? One is a film festival community, and one is, the community of local Utah politicians, statewide politicians. And I think to see that the humanity of Fred came through more strongly than any of the individual moments was incredibly comforting, right? Because Fred is someone who is simultaneously not afraid of change and capable of change, but understanding of the fear that change can engender in people and willing to talk about it. And I think that there's something that's so important about that message right now.
And, in terms of the specifics, it's not like those were standouts. There were so many specifics, and if we wanted to make a very heavy-handed film, we could have. I think we wanted to make a film that would start a conversation with people across the spectrum.
Right.
Because there aren't a lot of documentaries that do that, and I felt like if ever you're going to have a figure that transcends partisanship or tribalism or any of that, it's Fred Rogers, because our connections to him generally predate our sense of self or tribe or politics or anything else. He's kind of a unique cultural figure who speaks to us at our earliest to self, and in a way speaks to how we should behave, like reminding people, this is how you should be a good neighbor. This is how you should treat other people. And I feel like if, that's kind of a lesson that everybody should be constantly trying to remind ourselves of.
The footage that you see, you see a lot of behind the scenes. You see him in situations I never as a kid dreamt that I would see. But he was so, as a man of faith, but also he was so progressive in his thinking about everything. Race, sexuality, and in a way could explain that to kids. Where do you think that came from, and why is Fred Rogers the rarity and not the why aren't there more Fred Rogers? Why aren't there more people of faith who think the way he does? This is something that struck me as I saw it.
I think it's what makes me optimistic versus pessimistic is that regardless of where you come from, many of the people that we see walking out of screenings of this film feel like they're given enough ballast to be a better person and enough encouragement to take on that challenge. And I think whether that is wrestling with the challenge of faith and progressivism, or whether that's the challenge of wrestling with the way we treat our children or our parents, that little boost of saying, yeah, I can be truer to the best within me is, I think, something that we really need to hear, that ability to move forward and the strength to move forward is actually within us. You know, I love the fact that when people walk out of the film, you know, who loved it, they'll say not, I'm going to recommend this to somebody else, but I want to take somebody else, because they want to be in that experience with somebody else. And I think that that's something about joining together versus splitting apart. And I think Joanne put it so well. You know, she said, what would Fred be trying to do in this moment? Well, I think he'd be trying to mend the split. And there's so many splits along so many different lines. And I think there is a little bit of Fred that's left within each of us. And it's our opportunity now to try and mend the splits where we see them in our communities and in our lives.
Well, he came along at an interesting time where it was kind of the first generation being raised by televisions. I mean, with public television being such an important force for good, Sesame Street, other shows like Electric Company, and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So,
it was such a stroke of good timing, because I wonder if Fred had been born 5 years earlier or later, if he would have been Mr. Rogers. But he came of age at the moment television came of age, you know, and the story we tell in the film, which was of his senior year of college, he went home to visit his parents, and this is maybe 1948. They had just gotten one of the first televisions in the neighborhood, and he saw it, and he said, oh my God, this is an incredible invention. And he saw right then it was going to change society. And he said, and it's being so misused. And he saw right then that he was going to change his life's course, change what he was going to do after school, to go into television after having watched it for a couple of days. You know, he saw instantly the potential of it. So he moved to New York, he worked at NBC, he learned the ins and outs of television, and then moved back to Pittsburgh with the first educational station in 1953, WQED. So he was working in production behind the scenes for years before Mr. Rogers. So by the time the show went national in 1968, he had already been working in TV for 15 years. So he really understood the medium, and I think somebody said that he went into television because he hated it so. And he had I think he hated what was being done with it, but I think he really was a true believer in the potential for the good it could do. And that was the thing that I think he actually succeeded at. You know, I think he did more good with his show than, you know, virtually any other show I can think of.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it was also like that time, so much great television actually began that, everything from that was kind of a golden age of TV, the 60s.
Yeah, well, for sure. I mean, what's interesting, even in his experience in live TV in the 50s, is he was doing live classical concerts with Leonard Bernstein on NBC. He was doing your show of shows. Can you imagine, in this day and age, live classical concerts? Maybe you can.
Now, let's talk about how you guys came to this project.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, in a way, a gift to have this. I mean, I don't know how you came to it, so tell me how, and then how a little bit of the process of just going through the archives.
Sure. Well, I was making a film called The Music of Strangers about Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road Ensemble. And one day early on, when we were making the film, at lunch, I just turned to Yo-Yo and I said, so how did you figure out how to be famous? And he said, oh, Mr. Rogers taught me. And I reacted like you did. And he said, no, I'm not kidding. You know, he really saw when I first went on his show that it was something that I wasn't comfortable with. And he went out of his way to mentor me over many years to use fame as a positive force in my life and a positive force for change and not something that was going to be a weight around my neck. Mm-hmm. And after he finished saying that, a light bulb went off and I thought, there's something more to Fred Rogers than I remember as a 5-year-old. Mm. You know? So that was the first seed that led to many different different ideas over many years of thinking about Fred Rogers being a character I might want to pursue. And finally, I think after watching some videos of him giving speeches one night, I said, well, I think, is it a crazy idea to make a film about Fred Rogers? And so I called Nicholas here. So Nicholas is Yo-Yo's son. And Nicholas was on the show a couple times and knew Fred Rogers.
Yeah.
And I said, Nicholas, is it a crazy idea to make a film about Fred Rogers?
I think there's something really beautiful in life when questions get asked that are really easy to answer. And I was just overcome. It was immediately clear that this would be a really special project to undertake. And I think I said, yes, 1,000 times yes, let's do it, even before Morgan had finished the question. So, and then we set off and flew down to Pittsburgh. And I think, to your point about what are those little gems, all around us, it was like finding oneself in a diamond mine and just looking around the walls and just feeling like, gosh, there's a real person here, right? Not necessarily the person that we remembered. We sort of misremember Fred as we get older. But when you remember and look at what he really was, there's a real man there, and that was what was so fun to explore and so special to explore.
Yeah, I mean, because you think about Mr. Rogers as in many ways like a punchline in certain circles, and he's kind of the quintessential two-dimensional character. And I think it's something he grappled with in his life, like people not understanding the dimension of what he was doing. So I felt like our mission was to understand who he was as a person, and not treat him as a saint, because I know a lot of biographical documentaries can become hagiographic, and I feel like understanding that Fred was somebody who struggled with being good and trying to measure up to what he thought he could do was something that I related to. I mean, it was there's an element of like tortured artist about him that I actually really responded to because I humanized him in a way.
And I think that's what I remember looking at that clip. There's a clip, Fred did a special program after Bobby Kennedy's assassination, right? And it's a beautiful, beautiful program. And I don't think either of us had actually seen it before we went down to Pittsburgh, and the archive pulled it up for us. They said, you have to watch this. And we were sitting there transfixed, and you see Fred's voice quaver a little. You hear it quaver, and you see his hand take this small car, and he's sort of almost in a soothing way moving it back and forth. And you can tell that he is working through who is the person that he wants to be in this moment for the people that are struggling.
He's kind of processing it.
Yeah.
A little bit. Yeah.
And to see him process it, because we see the patina as it goes on, and growing up also in the 80s, when you watch it in the 80s, that he's so practiced, right? You don't see necessarily all of this, tortured artist component of him where he's trying to work out who is this person that I am and that I can bring to the world.
Now, you guys had unprecedented access to his archives and family photos and everything like that. Was there some kind of story you wanted to tell in the movie that just didn't make it, that hit the cutting room floor?
Well, I mean, the one thing I'll say about the access, that it was important to us as filmmakers to say, if we're going to do this, you have to trust us 100%, which means you can't have any control.
Yeah.
And they agreed to it, which was great. Because that was a huge leap for them, because they'd never done anything like that in decades. So once they decided to trust us, they trusted us completely, and they gave us so much access and so much incredible material. And there's so many amazing things about Fred Rogers and about the show. We made a very focused 94-minute movie, but we don't even talk about the fact that he was a vegetarian, pacifist who spoke multiple languages, who
woke up every morning and read the Bible in Greek. There's a to me, I think, I don't know if you feel this way, but the one story that I love that we just couldn't fit in was the fact that his younger sister, who's much younger than he, was adopted, and he was an early teen when she was adopted. And so he had these twinned childhoods where he had the consciousness of an adult while still having the heart of a child at the same time. And I think there's, it's too much armchair psychologizing to say, oh, well, this is what made him who he was, and that's silly. But at the same time, there's something beautiful about that, because even in that moment, he was connected on both sides to what it meant to be a kid and what it meant to be an adult and to watch a child growing up. And I think those connection points, even as they stretched as he got older and grew, he never lost both sides of that. And I always love that notion of what his childhood must have been like to feel a young person so intimately.
Yeah, I mean, in a much more superficial way. Another thing, we had a whole scene about music. And that as his boys grew up into teenagers, this is the 1970s, he wants to stay connected with them. So he'd say, well, give me the music you're listening to. So he's like, here, Dad, here's Frank Zappa. So Fred listens to Zappa, and Fred, who had been a composition major in college, and he was like, okay, this is interesting. Zappa was a very interesting writer. But he said the music my dad really responded to was this tape I gave him of Bob Marley songs.
Oh, wow.
And if you think about it,
That makes sense.
it makes so much sense. One love, and just kind of the message of the Rastafarian message was so in sync with what Fred was trying to do. And then it said to us, of course I didn't give him all the ganja songs.
One of my favorite parts of the documentary was the animation.
Yeah.
Like the animation sequences were kind of done in almost like a storybook way, but there was something really unique about them. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I mean, I think what we wanted to do was tell his childhood through how Fred accessed his childhood. So rather than kind of giving you the facts of his childhood, we more wanted to revisit his childhood when it influenced what he was doing in his show, because he pulled on his childhood all the time, pulled from his childhood all the time. So Fred narrates these narrations, which are him talking about his own childhood and the fears he had or the difficulties he had and how that influenced what he wanted to address in the show. And in that way, Daniel Tiger becomes kind of the perfect avatar for young Fred, because many people point this out, but Daniel Tiger was always really a pure expression of Fred's own inner child and childhood fears. So in that way, we did these animations with Daniel kind of in Fred's childhood home, kind of acting out what Fred would have acted out. And we got a lot of old children's books from the 40s and kind of used that aesthetic as something that would influence how we were going to tell the story. But it was also a way of telling that history emotionally rather than factually. And that was something I think we tried to do a lot in the film.
It was beautiful. I would love to see a full feature with that kind of style. It was one of my favorite parts of the film.
Thank you.
And if there's one final thought you could leave audiences with this film. I mean, it's so personal, I think, to everyone. I think that's why that standing ovation at Sundance and people just so moved. But how do you want audiences to feel?
I think when we really tried to digest Fred's message down to one thing, what I came up with was radical kindness. And he might have described that as grace or something else, but I think putting more of that into our culture and into our society, the more we can advocate for that, the better we'll all be. So if the film can do a little bit of advocacy for radical kindness, then that's what I want people to take away.
I could see that as a punk song, radical kindness, extreme kindness.
Punk band, even.
Yeah,
exactly.
Morgan, Nicholas, thank you for being on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks.
Take care.
You guys got to get out of here. We got to get out of here.
What do you do with the mad that you feel? And that first line came straight from a child. I work with children, doing puppets in very personal communication with small groups. What do you do with the mad that you feel when you feel so mad you could bite? When the whole wide world seems oh so wrong and nothing you do seems very right? What do? Do you punch a bag? Do you pound some clay or some dough? Do you round up friends for a game of tag or see how fast you go? It's great to be able to stop when you've planned a thing that's wrong and be able to do something else instead and think this song. I can stop when I want to, can stop when I wish, can stop, 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 anytime. And what a good feeling to feel like this and know that the feeling is really mine. Know that there's something deep inside that helps us become what we can. For a girl can be someday a lady, and a boy can be someday a man.
I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.